This morning we are in a late model JK with an L86 10-speed. At least I think it's an L86. It might be an LT1. Great combination, as you know. I just had this Jeep up near Park City. Temperatures were pushing about 0, and I was sitting in a parking lot, and this windshield had a little crack in it before that chip. And I was just sitting in a parking lot, and I heard the windshield crack, and I saw this crack just spread across the windshield. It was quite interesting. I get calls every day from guys asking questions about how these conversions work. Why is yours different than this guy, and how does that guy do it? So I thought I'd talk a little bit about power adders in the JK, and if you go back over the years in my videos, you'll probably see most of what we're going to talk about today, but I'm going to try to condense it a little bit more into one video. We're only going to talk about 3 power adders, and that's going to be all V8 conversions, the Hemi, the hybrid, and then the GM powertrain. Yes, there are superchargers, turbochargers, throttle body spacers, programmers, you know, all the stuff that's out there, headers, but really all of those somewhat pale in comparison to getting a V8. Even the OE manufacturers now are trying to mimic V8 performance with smaller engines and boosted turbocharged engines and all that. But the reality is most of us are happiest with a V8. But because of environmental concerns and everything else that's going on in the world, V8s are somewhat getting squeezed out of production vehicles. So we're going to talk about 1, the Hemi, 2, the GM powertrain, and 3, the hybrid. Probably the easiest one to understand is the Hemi, because it's a Chrysler product going into a Chrysler vehicle. Now that doesn't mean it's easy to do. The Hemi has some upsides and it has some downsides, just like the other powertrains. What is the upside to the Hemi? Well, being a Mopar product, you can integrate it into the JK quite easily. But again, there's some considerations we have to consider here. When a JK is built, there's something called a vehicle configuration and engineering files. And what that is on the assembly line, if you have a rear window defroster, if you have a hardtop, if you have an automatic, if you have a manual, all these options are coded into your engineering files. And that way the modules can be programmed to support those options. So let's just say you had a soft top JK. It wasn't delivered from the factory with a hard top. Then you put a hard top on it. So you're going to notice you don't have the rear windshield wiper control, you don't have the rear defroster, etc. Now you can install those components, but it's most likely not going to work. Why? Because it's not in your engineering files. So you take it to the dealer, you put a hard top on, and what the dealer does is they go through Dealer Connect and they update the engineering files to say that this vehicle with this VIN number now has a hardtop. Now you have to install the hardware, that would be like the switches, but as far as the software goes, that has to be done through Chrysler. And there's a reason to do that. I know it's a pain. Like a lot of guys upgrade to the Mopar remote start, and you would think it would just work, but it doesn't, because again, the vehicle configuration and the engineering files don't say that that vehicle has a remote start, so the software doesn't know what to do. So by going to Dealer Connect and then uploading, hey, this vehicle now has this option, Chrysler updates the modules, whether it's the TIPM or the WCM, to support that function. Now the good thing about that is, let's say you're going down the road, you're 1,000 miles away from home or even at home, and something fails. Like let's say your TIPM goes bad, and you put a new one in. Well, Chrysler's going to reflash that TIPM through YTech. And now that you've had the engineering files updated, it knows that now you have a rear windshield wiper defroster or a remote start. And those files are downloaded and everything works as it should. If you make a modification and you don't tell the network that that update's been made, there's a really high likelihood that that's not going to work. So when we talk about putting a Hemi in, it just doesn't go in there and work. You got to change stuff. You got to tell the computer, oh, it's now a V8. You got to change the wiring, obviously, because you got more cylinders and different sensors and all that. For the most part, the Hemi has been rationalized, and guys have been working on this for years. I used to work with Dave over at BG Automotive way back. He was one of the first guys to actually do the Hemi and the JK, and he had connections with Chrysler just like some of the other shops do today. And it was a little bit more complex, because when it came to things like electronic stability program and cruise control, a lot of times you see that functionality was lost. And we still see that in some of the oddball Hemi conversions, like manual transmissions. For some reason, sometimes the fans don't work, or the cruise control is intermittent, things like that. But they're getting all that ironed out. In fact, I think they have most of that ironed out. So now what you have essentially is a hacked or a patched calibration and possibly operating system. Operating system is like Windows, and the calibration would be a program like Word. So you change all these parameters to say, hey, look, now I got a V8 in this vehicle, and then the operating system does its best to accommodate that. And in most cases, you can get the functionality that you need for that conversion. So let's look at the hardware on the Hemi. The Hemi is cast iron and it's heavy. It is relatively large. So one of the biggest downsides, obviously, is cooling. Imagine having a giant cast iron pot under your hood. It's obviously going to be a lot more difficult to cool than an aluminum pot. Aluminum sheds heat a lot better than cast iron does. And then the size of the Hemi means it has a lot more iron in it versus, let's say, the 3.8. The 3.8 is an iron engine. The 3.8 weighs just over 400 pounds. The LS weighs just over 400 pounds. The Hemi is quite a bit heavier than that, and what that leads to is more difficult cooling. The physical size of the Hemi is a little more challenging. In a lot of cases, you need to massage the firewall and maybe move the steering shaft next to the brake booster to get clearance for the exhaust manifolds. And then just physically, the weight can change vehicle dynamics, because now you're adding a lot of weight not only on top of the front axle but in front of it. And you guys know that when you put a 300-pound bumper on the front of your JK with a winch, how much that can affect vehicle dynamics. Well, you're basically doing the same thing with a Hemi. When you have a Pentastar, which is relatively small and light engine set pretty far back, or an LSLT, which is a larger engine but very compact because it's overhead valve and it's set pretty far back, most of the weight you're adding to the vehicle is towards the center. So vehicle dynamics don't change that much. But at the end of the day, the JK is a pretty solid vehicle, and that doesn't affect things too much. So I would say the benefits of the Hemi are easier integration, and the downside's obviously going to be the size and the weight, and also the fact that the Hemi is, even the third generation Hemi, is still pretty old technology. The technology in that motor just isn't up to 2023 standards. And I think Chrysler did that on purpose, because if you look at the high-tech V6s, now the twin-turbo straight six, you look at GM and Ford, Ford went with the Coyote, GM took the LT to a new level with direct injection and all that. Chrysler just kind of left the Hemi alone, and I think the reason they did that is they knew they were going to obsolete it and replace it with something, which it appears is what they're going to do. Next, let's look at the pure GM powertrain. There's a lot of advantages to running a powertrain the way the manufacturer intended it. So Motec's goal from the beginning was, one, because we originated in California, was to remain legal, 50 state legal. Two, stay true to the manufacturer powertrain, the way it was supposed to run. The transmission, the engine, the injection, just everything that operates that powertrain needs to work the way the manufacturer intended it. And that's what Motec did. We take the entire powertrain from the donor vehicle. Let's just say this one here is from a 2017 Silverado. I'm not sure what it's from, but let's just say this is a 2017 L86. The engine, the transmission, the engine harness, which includes the transmission harness, the ECM, the TCM, everything is GM and it's programmed like GM. We are not hacking it or patching it like the Hemi guys are to get their functionality. We're leaving it alone the way GM intended. Now, there's massive benefits to that. One is you can do anything to this powertrain that you could do with the OE vehicle. So if you wanted to put a blower on a Silverado, if you wanted to tune it, if you need to diagnose it with trouble charts, all you got to do is diagnose it just like you would any other GM vehicle. There is no special knowledge involved. The wire colors, the wire counts, the power distribution, the ground distribution, everything is exactly the same as the donor vehicle. One of the biggest benefits of going that route is US EPA compliance. Because when the US EPA certifies a powertrain in a vehicle for sale here in North America, that means that it's legal to register and drive that vehicle in North America. The engine change regulations, whether it's the ARB, the BAR, or the US EPA, are clear that if you're going to do an engine conversion or swap, you got to pretty much bring over everything from the donor vehicle into your vehicle and keep it stock. So if you look at Motec's EO, it says stock powertrain, stock harness, stock modules, etc. Because that powertrain has already been approved for sale in the USA by the US EPA. Now, you can't say that with a hack or a patch calibration. And I'm not going to get into this too far because it gets complicated, but there's something called CVNs, calibration verification numbers. And when a manufacturer certifies that vehicle, there is a series of numbers and letters, and they're called calibration verification numbers. And these numbers add up checksums, which ultimately tell you what that tune is. It's kind of like a version of your software. Like if you have Word and you update it, now you have a new version of Word. And you ask, well, why would the government do that? Or more specifically, why would California do that? Well, prior to about 2015, engine conversions came in, and then the inspection was done by a referee. Here in Nevada, we did it with G2. I was a G2 for 20 years. And it was up to the inspector to do a proper, thorough inspection. Look at tampering. Tampering would be things like hardware-driven emissions devices, the gas cap, fuel restrictor, catalytic converters, and you got to make sure you got the right catalytic converters, two-way, three-way, etc. Because some converters only handle 2 gases, some handle 3 gases. So that configuration had to remain the same as a stock vehicle, whether you had an EGR valve, a secondary air system, etc. So what it came down to was a lot of interpretation by the referee or the inspector. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of ambiguity. And if you look at the US EPA engine change guidelines, it says that engine conversions can be challenging. It does require a highly educated tech to know what they're doing. Now, we know that there's a lot of techs out there that are not highly educated that pass these all the time. And there's a lot of nefarious stuff that goes on. But the bottom line is that if you want to pass a CVN test, they plug into the OBD2 port of your Jeep, they pull the CVNs out, and they compare that to the manufacturer's supply data to the US EPA, and this is all online. And if they don't match, you don't pass. One of the main reasons they did this was, and it wasn't just in Jeeps but other vehicles, is they'd, let's say, put a Hemi in a JK, and they take it down for a smog. There was no codes. It would pass the visual, it would pass visible smoke, all that stuff. But then some smart guys were saying, well, wait a minute, this vehicle should have 6 of the 9 monitors supported, but they weren't. They were all turned off. And back in the day, most of the analyzers only looked at supported monitors. So if you go in and you turn a monitor off, it's not going to look at that. You're going to have no codes. Your monitors are going to be set, at least the ones that are supported, and you're going to pass. Well, there wasn't really a good way to combat that. So I did meet with the lab guys and the politicians up in Carson City. How do we get around this? Well, it's the same thing that California did, and that's CVN testing. Because if you plug in and your CVNs don't match, that means that the operating system or the calibration has been modified and those monitors may have been turned off. So this is a huge benefit for staying with a non-hacked, non-patched operating system. So we can stay with the donor powertrain with OE modules and operating systems. So what it boils down to is we're running a pure GM powertrain, and we leave the Chrysler side alone. We don't modify the TIPM, we don't modify the wireless module or any other modules in the vehicle. And then we use a small CAN bridge or interpreter module that allows CAN signals to go back and forth between the two sides. The beauty of that is you can now upgrade your GM side and diagnose it just like you would a factory vehicle. You can now upgrade and diagnose your Chrysler side just like you would with a factory vehicle. There is no special knowledge involved. We don't have a patched or a hacked calibration where if you need to update a module and you got a Hemi, you may not get the results that you want after you update that module. In our conversion, any of the factory Chrysler modules can be diagnosed and updated just like they would in the factory vehicle. More benefits of the LS-LT, in our opinion, are GM powertrains have always just been a little bit ahead of the curve when it comes to value for money and performance. The LS and LT engines are all aluminum, at least most of them are, so the weight is really not drastically different than the OE powertrain. They can run 6, 8, and even 10-speed transmissions, which are state-of-the-art. They're lighter, they cool better, they fit better. There's just really no downside mechanically to the LS and the LT engine in a JK or anything. And that's why you see so many companies using these engines in their limited production vehicles or their hot rod builds or icons, or even the English and the Europeans are using these engines in their coveted vehicle because you get a lot of bang for your buck. They have a lot of performance. They're small, they're compact, they're light. You can say what you want about an overhead valve engine, but compared to a double overhead cam engine or a 4-valve engine, they are small and compact. So what you get with our conversion, and this has been our mission goal since day one, is emissions compliance, and there's a caveat there. Emissions compliance means that you have to build the vehicle to the standard. A lot of guys think, oh, if I just buy this and put whatever converter on I want, whatever intake on I want, etc., it's going to pass. And that's not accurate. You have to stick to the rules. You have to stick to the executive order. So besides emissions compliance, you get performance, you get lighter weight, you get better cooling, you get better serviceability, you get lower cost. But the key thing is keeping the GM side stock, keeping the Chrysler side stock, and then fitting a small bidirectional bridge to make the two sides talk to each other. This brings us to the hybrid, and the hybrid is very popular. I remember about 10 years ago, I had guys approaching us and saying, hey, we can make your LS run inside of a Hemi operating system, which is kind of the last thing we wanted to do, because Hemi operating systems are a lot more difficult to work with, they're more expensive to support, and the Hemi engine itself, I'm a big Hemi fan, as you guys know, but it just came down to the alternative of using an all GM powertrain was far more appealing, especially when it came to legality. So what a hybrid essentially is mixing and matching of mechanical components. So let's say you take an LS3 engine and you put a 5-speed Chrysler transmission behind it. Now that was never a US EPA certified powertrain configuration. So as far as being illegal goes, of course, a lot of you guys are going to say, hey, my jurisdiction doesn't require a smog check. Well, it doesn't make it legal because federal law applies to all states, and what it comes down to is enforcement in your jurisdiction. And a lot of jurisdictions have no enforcement, so you can do whatever you like. However, remember, if you sell that vehicle or it goes to an inspection area which does require an emissions check, you can be liable for that tampering. Even if that vehicle is sold 2 or 3 times down the road, you can still be liable for that tampering, because I know of people that have got prosecuted for that. So the advantages of the hybrid are you can put the smaller, lighter weight GM engine in and run a Chrysler transmission. And you say, why would you want to do that? Because the Chrysler transmissions in general are inferior. Well, it just makes getting the functionality you want a lot easier if you don't have the technology to do it the other way. So if you take an LS3 and you change the firing order to a Hemi and you change out the trigger wheels and all that, you essentially run it as a Hemi, and electronically the vehicle doesn't know the difference. It thinks it's operating a Hemi, but it's really operating a hybrid LS engine. The benefit to that is getting the functionality like cruise control, air conditioning, and all that is easy, because you're fooling the operating systems to think that it's operating a Hemi when it's really operating a GM powertrain. Now, where it gets a little bit tricky is when GM went to the LT, they really stepped up technology. They went to the continuous variable valve timing to handle the high compression. They went to direct injection. They went to all this technology that the Chrysler modules cannot support. So what we're seeing is these engines being dumbed down to the Chrysler level. So if you remove the direct injection and you remove the continuous variable valve timing, essentially what you have is an older LS style engine, which is what the Chrysler operating system can operate. So I'd say that's a really big downside for the hybrid. Not only the illegality of it, but you're never going to get the full functionality that the manufacturer engineered into that powertrain. One of the beauties of having a pure GM operating system is GM can come out with whatever they want. L8T, an L87, an LT2, you name it. And all we have to do is fit our CAN bridge to make the two sides talk, and we can operate that GM powertrain the way GM intended it to run. Now, does that mean that the hybrid sucks? No, of course it doesn't. You can make the hybrids run excellent, and some of them do. But you still have a hybrid that's going to be more difficult to service, more difficult to tune. You're going to have adapter plates and trigger wheels and things that you wouldn't have in an OE powertrain. So base your decision on what it is you want. If you want a Hemi, get a Hemi. The Hemi JKs run pretty awesome. The Hemi JK has been rationalized to the point that now Chrysler's putting them in the JLs, and they have a long track record. When it comes to an all Chrysler Hemi powertrain versus an all GM powertrain, it's not really apples and oranges. It's kind of apples to apples, because they both perform excellent. The GM powertrain is going to be lighter. It's going to cool better. So if you're going to be towing a trailer in Colorado, we hear a lot of stories about the Hemis overheating. And don't fool yourself, some of the GM powertrains overheat too. Out here in the Southwest, in the desert, when we hit triple digits, we have to fit 4, 5, 6 coolers sometimes on these vehicles to keep them cool. But the bottom line is it's just easier to cool the LS and the LT. And the LT seems to have a better cooling system than anything out there. I don't know what GM did, but they just seem to stay cooler than all the other powertrains that we work with, even the LSs. If you want the lighter weight, you want the lower cost and service and maintainability. I think the LT has an edge there. And the simplicity of the operating system, then the Hemi probably has an edge there. And then the hybrid, of course, is somewhere in between. The hybrid is really an exercise in gaining the functionality you want by making the mechanical component conform to the operating system, where the pure GM powertrain leaves the mechanical component alone and makes the appropriate accommodations for the electronics to work together. So I hope that explains a little about the most popular V8 conversions for the JK, or at least the top 3. We know there's guys out there putting in diesels and Duramaxes and Ford Coyotes and all this other stuff, and we've actually helped guys with that. But guys, when you drop a LT into a JK or even a JL, put a 10-speed transmission behind it, it's all bolt in, there is no fabrication. The JL's especially nice because there is no power steering pump to deal with. The LT engines we used didn't have power steering pumps, they used electronic steering. So the JL having that power steering pump makes the engine install so clean and so easy. And then you hit the road in it. I know that my LT JL will exceed 20 miles to the gallon on the highway and get pretty good mileage around town too. This LT JK I'm in right now, I just took to Park City and back, like I said, and averaging 80 miles per hour, I saw over 16 miles to the gallon. And I would say that pretty much tops most of the other options out there. Of course, there's going to be anomalies where this can get better, that can get better, and I'm sure that the little 4-cylinder turbos can get better. But you got to look at the big picture, and that is drivability, sound, reliability, longevity, and everything else that goes into it. So I'm not saying in this video any of these powertrains are better than the others. They each have their advantages and disadvantages, and you need to take a look at what is your requirement. Is it emissions legality? Is it brand loyalty? Is it cost, performance? And there's a whole bunch of options to choose from. So we're going to take this LT JK to the trail, and we'll see you shortly. I do have a couple of exciting builds coming up. I'm going to change the drone battery. We got a very nice Rubicon here. I'll tell you, at 80 miles an hour, this thing was a dream. It was hard to stay at 80 miles an hour. It just wanted to go. Let's take a look under the hood. I know it's the 6.2 LT, I just don't know which one. Let me tell you a little story about this hood. I think this is called the Hard Rock hood. Back in about 12 or 13, I was hanging out with Phil Howell up in Utah, guy from 4-Wheel Drive magazine, one of those magazines. And he had a prototype hood from Chrysler, and these openings were functional. They actually worked. And I said, that's great. Unfortunately, when they went into production, as we can see here, they blocked them off, so they're not functional. So here we go, 6.2 LT. Not sure if it's an LT1 or not. Typical Motec intake, battery tray. Notice the battery terminals, we upgrade those. You can tell this is a Rubicon by those 2 relays over there in the corner. Those are for the lockers. Everything else is pretty much standard. We got our dual header radiator. This radiator is pretty special. It doesn't look special, but this radiator has 4 headers and a beefed up tube. It's similar to a Caterpillar tractor core.